not articulated as such by Ranciere himself explicitly and unequivocally. Sometimes the concept is used interchangeably with the concept of the police. Often it also refers to the actual practice of governing. Archy in Ranciere's theory appears as the process of legitimate domination. It is then associated with the exercise, practice, and execution of power. It is an activity of ruling in accordance with a particular logic. Referring to Aristotelian definition of the citizen, Ranciere says, and I quote, "There is a name given to the subject, polites, that is defined by a partaking, metexis, in the form of the action, archein," end of quote. Similarly, Arendt in her book The Promise of Politics speaks of archein as an action, an activity of leadership from which she then deduces the hierarchical structure of ruling in the form of those who command and those who obey and follow commands. However, arche and archein are not the same. Arche, in my view, has a more complicated meaning. From the works of pre-Socratic Greek philosophers Thales of Miletus, Anaximander, and later, actually Aristotle himself, we learn that meaning of arche is as a first principle or essence of the things that exist, the primary substance, the nature of the whole. This meaning is not the same as ruling or logic of ruling or commanding. It speaks not about the logical arrangement of rules and principles of action, but about the essence, the nature of the whole. I believe in this interpretation of arche, it is important to note the aspect of the wholeness. Arche, as a primary substance of the things that exist, is in each and all of them. It is a part of the whole, which these parts constitute themselves, and as such, it is the whole itself. But what is this unifying wholeness in the context of Ranciere's theory of democracy? I claim the exercise of police order, hierarchical power relations, disruption of system of distribution by democratic politics, it all takes place within the larger space of human domains of society. I believe that limitations of the possibilities of democratic potentiality arise from Ranciere's reduction of society as the totality of a human domain to the field of execution of functions of power structures only. In the words of Castoriadis, and I quote, "Society is not a property of composition," end of quote. It is a complex whole which can only be in and through its parts the relationship which has to be reflected upon itself as a principle and model of itself. The arche then is not the principle of ruling, but the society, which is the principle and model of itself. There can be no members of society who are outside or alongside of it unless they are not humans. This is precisely what Aristotle tells us in his passage in Book 1 of Politics, which Ranciere cites at length. The main difference, as I see it there, is not that humans possess faculty of speech, language, logos, which Ranciere sees as a germ of the order of domination, and that animals have voices only, but that humans are able to reflect upon themselves being a part of society by distinguishing between advantageous and the harmful, right and wrong. Aristotle says, and I quote, "For it is the special property of man in distinction from the other animals that he alone has perception of good and bad and right and wrong, and the other moral qualities," end of quote. The distinction Aristotle is describing is not between species, since both are declared animals and both they have voice, but between the world of animals and society of which humans and the language are constitutive and constituting parts. If we were to think of society as arche, in terms of the essence of its own self-constituting in Castoriadis terms, then there is no human who is outside of it. If we accept that society is not a community of animals or gods, then we say that humans belong to society. If that is the case, then even those who are excluded and ignored in the process of distribution of the social, as Ranciere presents it, they are still part of the human community. And if arche is the essence of society, then those who have no part and no voice, but are humans, are also the part of the arche. If we agree to that, then the whole democratic project constructed by Ranciere is not the opposition to arche, but reaffirmation of its subjects of being a constitutive and constituting part of society. Democracy affirms itself and creates political subject within the arche. This location of democracy within the arche can be traced by examining and following the concept of the supplement, which Ranciere invokes in his theory. According to Ranciere, politics disappear when the political relationship in the form of ruling and being ruled is undone by the logic of distribution of parts. The subject of the relationship then becomes emptied of itself It no longer participates in the self-ruling and becomes dominated by the structures of the police order. However, it does not mean that the subject of politics is eliminated and taken out of existence. It is not. The subject of politics becomes invisible, muted, unnoticed, does not participate in the distribution of the social, but it still remains the part of society, of social body, even if unrecognized by the power structure. The shadow of the subject, the lack of position, the gap, improper property, empty name of freedom, all these names used by Ranciere refer to the political subject, to those who have no part, to people, to demos. Paradoxically, the invisibility of those who are unaccounted and have no place in the process of division and distribution of parts is actually the affirmation of their presence. This presence of the political subject, which reaffirms its existence by its own invisibility, by its being not, is the function of democracy as the supplement. I argue that precisely the supplement, in the form of democratic politics, it has the potential to alter and to transform the order that defines the allocation of the ways of doing, being, and saying. This should not be seen as a collapse of democracy into the logic of police, but as a transformation of the police order and the logic of distribution. In other words, it can be seen as the creation of the new democratic archetype. It seems Ranciere himself believes in this possibility. He says, democracy is a specific situation in which there is an absence of qualifications that in turn becomes the qualification for the exercise of a democratic archy. However, this is probably the only time when Ranciere puts words archy and democracy together. But the possibility of democratic archy is there. In order to transform, to alter, to reshape or change the existing system, democracy first establishes itself as a part of it. But how can democracy be a part of the system of distribution of the social if the exclusion from it is the very condition of democratic politics to happen? Paradoxically, it becomes possible by assigning democracy the supplementary function in the process of the count of the parts of population. Derrida explains the concept of the supplement as that which adds itself, the surplus. I quote, the fullest measure of presence, that which accumulates and accumulates presence. End of quote. Therefore, the absence of demos in the system of distribution and counting of parts is rendered present by the supplement of democracy, which fills the void, closes the gap, and brings two worlds of visible and invisible together. The gap in the system, which Ranciere presents us with, is not nothingness, but on the contrary, it refers to the actual place, even if that place is empty. The gap then renders the invisible visible. It stands for and affirms not the nothingness, but on the contrary, the existence of a particular place and space. It identifies the presence of not being of those who have no place in the particular design of the system. Paradoxically, it makes the invisible visible. It eliminates the place of, as I put it, eliminates the place of no place. Derrida says, I quote, sorry, supplement supplements. It adds only to replace. It intervenes or insinuates itself in the place of. The end of quote. Logically, then, there has to be the place in order for something to be in the place. Hence, democracy or democratic politics and the political subject place itself in the place of invisibility in order to appear, to become visible. At the same time, this empty space, this gap, this invisibility is what prevents democratic politics from collapsing into the system of police and from conforming to the logic of the system. Through supplementation, political subject partakes, that is, acquires part, but not in the system per se. It acquires part in the absence of those who have no part. It partakes in being in the place of not being. Within this set, while democratic politics does not collapse into the system of police, it also does not identify itself with the void or non-existence. Once it establishes itself as a part of those who have no part, it does not vanish, as Ranciere argument makes us to believe, but becomes situated in the system of distribution while not really being part of it. Democratic politics in the capacity of the supplement replaces the empty space with itself, and in the process of it constitutes the presence and renders the subject of the political relationship visible. As such, it constitutes the new principle of being. It introduces its own archy. This moment of substitution, in my view, is the theoretical space where thinking of institutionalization of the political and of democratic politics becomes feasible. The supplement adds only to replace. What democratic politics replaces is the empty space created by the logic of distribution of the social itself. This empty space is already located within the larger system of governance. Through substitution, democratic politics becomes the part, and in the process of this becoming, alters and changes it. It brings in, it injects its own logic, its own archy based on the principle of equality of everybody in society, on the basis of them all being humans. This provides for the possibility of alteration of existing social designs and principles of their function. Derrida says that supplement harbors within itself the possibility of perversion. Democratic politics through supplementation, that is by addition, which creates the excess, which cannot be accommodated by the police order, implies the possibility of alteration, change, perversion of archy, and change of society as a whole. In the words of Derrida, substitution always has the form of sign. The scandal is that the sign, the image, or the representative become forces and make the world move. End of quote. Yeah, I don't really have a conclusion because it's kind of a open question. So.
Thank you for. We now move to Victoria Briggs. She's a research student at the School of Politics and IR at Queen Mary, University of London. Her research covers contemporary continental political theory and philosophy, democratic conflict theory, and post-Marxist political theory, whatever this is.
Yes, exactly. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you so much.
Sorry, I forgot the title of your talk, which is Fragments of Democracy in a World of Fragments.
I think for those familiar with Castoriadis' work, that's a clear indication of where the focus of my research lies. I have to say I became enamored a few years ago with Castoriadis' work, and I haven't been able to let go since. I want to first explain, I suppose, the position of this paper within kind of the broader project of my research. What I'm trying to do is start from a hypothesis of reading conflict as a sine qua non condition for democracy in Castoriadis, and then trace the concept of conflict through Castoriadis' work, try and look at this idea of an ontology of creation in conjunction with the Arendtian concept of natality, and then question my reading of the concept of conflict in Castoriadis via radical democratic theory. So from one perspective, the deliberative perspective, informed by Habermas, and the other, Chantal Mouffe's perspective, which is the post-structuralist perspective which emphasizes conflict. Now, of course, I can't do all of this in one paper. What I will try to do is look at two very small parts of this project. The first part is really a reading of the ontology of creation in Castoriadis, and how that implicitly challenges the assumptions of deliberative democracy. And the second part, and hopefully I will be able to fit within the time limits and get into it, is a very succinct identification of the moments as I see them in Castoriadis' work, which signpost the transformation of the concept of conflict. So, with that, I shall begin. And yes, I wanted to say a quick note of thanks to Antoine, who managed to give all the background that I wanted to give, which means that I can eliminate that from my presentation. So, thank you, Antoine. Okay. So I will start first with this investigation into rationality, and a particular vision of rationality that appears in Western thought from the Enlightenment onwards. That human beings are first and foremost rational has informed the common sense of Western thought from the Enlightenment onwards. This underlying assumption of the social sciences generally, and political theory particularly, is rarely questioned. There are, however, some notable exceptions. Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, in their dialectic of enlightenment, decried the transformation of the critical edge of reason into instrumental reason, resulting in Auschwitz. Michel Foucault, in Madness and Civilization, contended that reason is articulated through the systematic silencing of what is deemed unreason. Yet sapere aude, have courage to use your own reason, this motive of the Enlightenment remains compelling. This assumption of the primacy of rationality continues to claim hold on the modern imaginary and lies at the heart of theories advocating consensual forms of democracy. And what I propose to do in this paper is to expound Cornelius Castoriadis' ontology of creation and then retrace the development of the idea of conflict in his work, as I said. So the first part of this implicitly challenges the assumptions of deliberative democracy, and the second attempts to begin a dialogue with Chantal Mouffe's radical counterpart. Okay, so moving on then to imagination and reason. In On the Political, Chantal Mouffe asserts that it is the lack of understanding of the political and its ontological dimension which is at the origin of our current incapacity to think in a political way, and requests that an alternative be provided to the rationalist approach dominant in democratic theory. I believe that Cornelius Castoriadis' ontology of creation represents such an alternative. The world, not only ours, is fragmented, yet it does not fall to pieces. To reflect upon this situation seems to me to be one of the primary tasks of philosophy today. With this opens Castoriadis' world in fragments, thus setting the parameters of his philosophy and of his work as a whole. Traditionally, philosophy is associated with the search for truth. Truth about the world and about being was to be found along the way of logos or reason. Castoriadis asks how world and being exist for the human subject in the first place, and how the human subject possesses logos or reason. His answer lies in the theorization of radical imagination. And I quote, "Imagination and social instituting imaginary create ex nihilo. Thus we come to a view of human reason that entails radical imagination." The imaginary, simply put, is the unmotivated positing of new forms. The radical imaginary has a twofold expression. On the one hand, the radical imagination, on the other, the social imaginary. The radical imagination is defined as, and I quote, "the capacity to posit that which is not, to see in something that which is not there." And this is the capacity of the singular psyche. The social imaginary, also referred to as the radical social instituting imaginary, extends this definition to the collective level. The rebellious essence of imagination against determinacy and reason supplies Castoriadis with the philosophical arsenal necessary for the thinking of creation as more than cyclical birth and rebirth, but as an ontology of genetic creation. The irreducible moment of novelty sets the scene for Castoriadis' theorization of the social world as a process of institution, the radical instituting social imaginary. It is radical because it creates significations and institutions ex nihilo. It is instituting because of the dynamic state of being of the social historical world. And it is imaginary in the sense of invention, creation, not in the sense of invention fictitious. The radical imaginary is prior to the distinction between the real and fictitious. Rather, it is because radical imagination insists that reality exists for us, exists to cool, and exists as it exists. Castoriadis' imaginary refers then to the unending and undetermined social, historical, and physical creations of figures, forms, images, and reality and rationality are also such creations. This ontology of creation expresses the ordinary fact that each society constitutes a universe of being and of significations for itself in order to exist socio-historically. When a society recognizes its self-institution, is conscious of its historicity and perpetual genesis, a truly democratic interrogation of its norms becomes possible. The task of interrogation falls equally to philosophy and politics, and moreover, in the case of the single individual, to psychoanalysis. And Castoriadis locates this double birth of philosophy and politics in the Greek polis. Socrates' famous saying, "An unexamined life is not worth living," represents the beginning of the dual philosophical and democratic project. The philosophical project aims at the critical interrogation of established norms and meanings. The democratic project makes possible collective reflection and deliberation about such fundamental questions. Both are activities, and I think that is crucial for radical democracy, that dare to ask why we live and how we should live collectively as human beings. Philosophy and democracy thus break the closure of signification required for the institution of society. For Castoriadis, democracy represents the breaking of closure at the collective level. I think that is, excuse me. Okay, so I thought I would give you a short definition of democracy, which I think is quite expressive of Castoriadis' view. In its genuine signification, democracy consists in this, that society does not hold before a conception given once and for all of what is just, equal, or free, but rather institutes itself in such a way that the question of freedom, of justice, of equity, and of equality might always be posed anew. And therefore, the traditional understanding of imagination, which opposed it to intellect, reason, and reality, and coupled it with passions and emotions, aimed to domesticate, tame, or transcend its creative potency. So here's how a reason then takes precedence to reason. What then of the question of conflict? I have identified several moments in Castoriadis' work which I think are quite important to the transformation of this concept in his work. And the first lies in his earlier writings, his political and social writings, which have now luckily been translated into English, which makes it a much easier job for me. And in this analysis, he posits, together with other members of Socialisme Barbarie, the problem of grassroots organization and self-management, and rejects the idea of workers' management and those of a leading revolutionary party in favor of people's effective involvement in the managing of their own affairs, be those social, political, or economic. And the debates that escalated between Castoriadis and other members of Socialisme Barbarie were not of an academic nature, but were directly concerned with the revolutionary struggles as they unfolded in the everydayness of modern life. More so, the conflict between Castoriadis and Lefort revolved precisely around this problematic, their divergent interpretations of ongoing struggles and the nature of the group's association with them. As a result, Castoriadis undertook a thorough re-examination of the revolutionary project and the re-evaluation of Marxist theory, an enterprise that would finally lead to his break with Marx. At this point in time, so whilst he's writing with and for Socialisme Barbarie, the content of conflict is informed by Castoriadis' practical concerns and therefore revolves around class and revolutionary struggle. Castoriadis' contributions to Socialisme Barbarie were of a political nature, and these were questions concerning the need to rethink the revolution following the events of Russia in 1917 and the requirement of a renewed investigation of the content of socialism once it became clear that nationalization of the means of production did not result in the elimination of exploitation. Okay. As far as Castoriadis is concerned, then, the Soviet state was simply another historical apparatus for the domination of one class over another, and viewed the struggle against the bureaucracy as the fundamental task for the Soviet proletariat. And I would argue that the struggle against the bureaucracy is certainly a task for modern radical democrats as well, because bureaucracy has gone nowhere. It is still very powerful in Western and Eastern states. At this point, the configuration of the idea of conflict in Castoriadis continues to be posited in terms of class struggle, although the identity of the actors in question differs from Marxist analysis. Unlike others on the radical left who believed that the revolution in Russia had been nothing more than a bourgeois revolution which had passed for a proletariat one, however, Castoriadis had seen in the formation of Soviets at the beginning of the revolution an example of the effective and conscientious involvement of the proletariat, and thus an example of the potential for autonomous organization by the masses. The fact that these had been later subsumed under the umbrella of a party did not detract from the importance of these initial attempts by workers to take their destiny into their own hands. Thus, Castoriadis makes a move from the critique of bureaucracy towards the idea of proletariat autonomy. And whilst conflict is still theorized in terms of class struggle, already this presents the beginnings of a new and distinct approach to the questions of society. It is a matter then for the socialist society to organize itself in such a way that it provides itself with a necessary means of constant interrogation and contestation of existing circumstances. conflict thus gains a further dimension, the positive, contestatory force which aims at the transformation of society in view of changing circumstances. And I think that has a connection with the two spaces, the temporal and the spatial places that Antoine spoke about. And finally, the moments of 1968 is another important moment for the theorization of conflict in Castoriadis. The founders of the, at the time, disbanded Socialisme Barbarie contributed to the main movement with their collective work, Mai 78 La Brèche, under the authorship of Edgar Morin, Claude Lefort, and Jean-Marc Audrey, who was Castoriadis. Published in the immediate aftermath of the events, it was meant to open the debate over the revolutionary explosion that had been made in 1968. And I underline revolutionary explosion rather than a revolution that was under discussion. And this was because Castoriadis makes a clear distinction between the two. If the revolution is nothing more than an explosion of a few days or weeks, he says, the established order, the status quo, whether it knows it or not, whether it likes it or not, adapts very well. Even more contrary to common belief, it is in dire need of such an explosion. Historically, it is the revolution that enables reactionary revolts to survive through transformation, adaptation, and one may now have new proof of this. Conflict, then, more than an accidental representation of divergence between the instituted order and those contesting it, it is also essential for the survival of that order due to the transformation that it engenders. Whilst it is difficult to gain an immediate understanding of what the content of this transformatory impetus may be, positive or otherwise, as was discussed before, democracy is dangerous. It is unstable. However, such conflicts can be said to have revolutionary consequences when these changes are consecrated, for Castoriadis at least, in institutions. And by this he means both the instituting of rights, freedoms, and guarantees, but also, when this is not the case, the transformation of the mental outlook of societies, which has an effective impact on their concrete existence. The spirit of 1968, whatever its later consequences, had firstly demonstrated the persistence and the power of the aim of autonomy and encapsulated the criticism of the established order, the famous appeals to imagination, and obviously the celebration of freedom and jouissance, but above all of socialism and of a new social order. Such conflicts represent the ability of people to overcome political apathy, a consequence of the bureaucratization of the state and political institutions under modern capitalism, and once again reclaim their democratic rights to effective participation. Through this re-engagement with politics, such crisis of the established order gives society an awareness of the breadth and depth of the problems that it faces. And do I have time to conclude? And I shall leave it at that. Thank you very much.
So the last talk is by BenMeir, who received his master in philosophy from the New School, where he's currently completing his doctorate. He teaches at Molloy College in Long Island, and is also performing as a jazz musician. So the title of Sam's talk will be Rethinking Carl Schmitt Radical Democratic Theory.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me. I have a bit of a cold, so what I wanted to do in this essay was essentially establish a dialogue between Schmitt and Antonio Negri, two thinkers who are, of course, at opposite ends of the political spectrum. And yet there are common elements there which invite further reconstruction. To rethink Schmitt in light of Negri would seem to require, first of all, foregoing a standard reading of Schmitt, according to which sovereignty is essentially consists in the arbitrary personal decision of supreme authority and unhampered by any constitutional constraints. I'm going to try and get through this paper briefly. So, first, I want to argue that this doesn't really do justice to Schmitt's conception of sovereignty, which is in fact not defined in terms of some groundless irrational will expressed in personal decision. In the Verfassungslehre, Schmitt will argue that in a democracy, the people are the ultimate sovereign authority, inasmuch as they are the unique bearers of the constituent power. That is, the power to create a new constitutional and political order, as Schmitt puts it. The people are the bearer of the constitution-making power, and as such, grant themselves their constitution. They are, in other words, the only legitimate entity that can make the sovereign decision. A couple observations about Schmitt's theory of constituent power. First, he argues that the legitimacy of a constitution does not and cannot require a constitution to originate in conformity to previously valid constitutional norms. For Schmitt, the legitimacy of a constitution involves the question of the constituent power, but not the question of the agreement with the rules of no longer valid constitutional laws. Second, for Schmitt, the issuance of a constitution, and this is very important in light of Negri, does not mean, because it was exercised once, the constitution-making power, the constituent power, is thereby depleted. Alongside and above the Constitution remains the political will and unity of the people. Indeed, Schmitt will insist upon the continuous presence, permanence, of the constituent power. In other words, sovereignty is not exhausted with the creation of a new constitution. Insofar as the Constitution emanates from the continually living will of the people and is renewed by the community at every moment. In this sense, sovereignty has less to do with the discretionary power of an irrational and personal will, and more to do with the creative, form-giving power, the pouvoir constituant of the people as a concrete political unity. So, like sovereignty, constituent power stands outside and above the Constitution. It is unified and indivisible, not merely one power alongside other powers, but the comprehensive foundation of all other powers and divisions of powers. Constituent power, qua sovereign, transcends the Constitution, inasmuch as the manner of its activity cannot be prescribed constitutionally. It is only when the people have reached a decision over the type and form of their own political existence that one may regulate its formulation and execution. And in the Verfassungslehre, Schmitt's constitutional theory, he will designate the people as a legitimate subject, as the legitimate subject of the pouvoir constituant. Now, moving on to Negri, he begins, of course, his book Insurgencies with the famous line, "To speak of constituent power is to speak of democracy." An observation that resonates with the reading of Schmitt that I want to propose here. And as does his definition of constituent power as, quote, the source of production of constitutional norms, that is, the power to make a constitution, and therefore to dictate the fundamental norms that organize the powers of the state. Negri identifies three fundamental characteristics of the constituent power. First, it's a breaking power, which includes the radical reformulation of socio-political organization. Constituent power is described as a force that bursts apart, interrupts, unhinges any pre-existing equilibrium and any possible continuity. Second, it's an expansive power, uninterrupted formativity, he writes. And one way to get at this idea is through the concept of living labor, a creative and world-making theory of labor that Negri develops by drawing on the key passages from Marx, specifically from the Grundrisse. He has a very interesting reading of the Grundrisse. Where labor is the living, form-giving fire. It is, quote, the transitoriness of things, their temporality, as their formation by living time. the transformation of the constituent power, and I want to emphasize this point, that according to Negri, that Marx initiates, will ultimately mean that we cannot have political democracy without economic democracy. And that's sort of encapsulates what I want to argue in this paper, that by bringing Schmitt and Negri together, we can understand democratic legitimacy as demanding economic democratization. The third fundamental quality of constituent power is its permanent revolution. Constituent power is theorized by Negri as an ongoing, autonomous, productive force. The process begun by constituent power never stops, in short. Like Schmitt, Negri maintains that constituent power cannot be destroyed or consumed by the objects of its creation. In fact, Negri will claim that constituent power is boundless. Its only measure is the limitlessness of the multitude. And this gives rise to a problem, because viewed as a limitless and unregulated movement, how can constituent power ever give way to a stable, lasting constitutional order? This is a worry that Arendt would raise. If the constituent power is truly beyond measure, then we seem to be opening the door to an unwelcome condition of legal nihilism. For Negri, constitutionalism is an oppressive force. It's constituted power. So he has a strong opposition to constitutionalism in any form. I suggest that we bracket for the moment his notion of constituent power as absolute opposition to constitutionalism, and consider instead the contribution that Negri can make with respect to reconceptualizing Schmitt's theory of constituent power in terms of a radical democratic practice aimed at transforming capitalist relations of domination and inequality. So, to begin with, Negri recognizes 2 minutes.
5 minutes.
Oh.
To
begin with,
yeah, 5 more.
Okay. Negri observes that in general, constituent power is viewed as something that serves to found a system, and that's all. And this speaks to Schmitt, because for Schmitt, the constituent power is essentially the founding power, the ability to found a new social political order. I claim that Negri's democratic theory can be understood as essentially expanding the concept of constituent power. He writes that one of the gravest errors of political theorists is considering constituent power a pure political act separate from existing being, mere irrational creativity. He says, rather, constituent power is something completely different. It is a decision that emerges out of the ontological and social process of productive labor. So, Negri is ontologizing the constituent power, and this is very significant. He's not denying that constituent power requires a political standpoint, a decision-making capacity, but rather his claim is that constituent power of the multitude must also be grasped in terms of its ontological and sociological basis. He rejects thoroughly the possibility of a separate political sphere, arguing that throughout history the supposed relative autonomy of the political, as defined in Schmitt, has consistently served as part of an ideological project to dominate the indifference of living labor. The constituent power of the multitude, viewed ontologically, is nothing other than the creation of a new social being or a new human nature, each person reinventing himself or herself with others, producing a common life and a new social body. And for Negri, this is most visible and forceful in the urban dimension, in the city. I'll just say that from an ontological standpoint, we are concerned with new forms of life, new ways of being. And no theory of constituent power can afford to ignore the creativity, versatility, innovation of the multitude, inasmuch as it is expressed in the ongoing invention of the human. Negri's notion of constituent power emphasizes creative originality and the intrinsic capacity of human praxis to usher the new into the world. Likewise, in terms of the social standpoint, the constituent power of the multitude appears in the cooperative and communicative networks of social labor. Negri is a champion of cooperation, and that concept of cooperation we find in Negri, I maintain that it allows us to envision the extension of radical democratic praxis to new social spaces now occupied by hierarchical, bureaucratic organizations, especially the urban setting and the workplace. Indeed, workplace democracy is an essential component of further democratic actualization. In fact, Negri will maintain that there can be no political democracy that is not an economic democracy. Workplace democracy, or worker self-management, which provides a broadening and reinforcement of democratic principles, specifies precisely a non-hierarchical form of organization, a democratic process of management which rejects the logic of command and its appropriation of the free cooperative practice of the multitude. So, in conclusion, drawing on Negri, we can reconstruct Schmitt's theory towards radical democracy, not only as political democracy, but economic democracy as well. The ontologization of constituent power is Negri's version of the democracy of everyday life, a concept which has been developed by Jason Frank. His account allows us to formulate the extension of democratic practices to greater areas of social life. In creating a democratic workplace, for example, we are fashioning a space in which individuals acquire the participative skills, values, and experiences that make for a vibrant democratic polity. I would argue that in the process of nurturing participatory attitudes, we not only facilitate and reinforce self-management within an enterprise or neighborhood, school, we are also educating individuals towards self-determination and democratic participation in the political arena. Indeed, the same fundamental commitments, fundamental commitments that urge us to promote political democracy should compel us to promote economic democracy as well. A society in which enterprises are collectively governed by all those actively contributing to the process of production. And the exercise, in closing, the exercise of constituent power, self-governance, and free practice is inseparable from the democratization of society. And in this sense, economic democracy is essential to the legitimacy of a fully democratic society, which is to say that democratic legitimacy has to be grounded in the social realm just as much as the political.
Thank you also for keeping the timing. We now have the two discussants, Gerasimos Karavitis, sorry the pronunciation, and Juan Pablo Ferrero. I don't know who wants to begin first. Do you have an author or?
If you prefer to begin, that's fine with me.
Okay, I can begin.
5-10 minutes each.
5-10 minutes. Okay. Well, yes, starting with Mykolas Gudelis. He presented a paper, let's remind that to everybody. Political relationship as politics and democracy in Ranciere's 10 Theses on Politics. He, as he well pointed out, there are two, his paper has two parts, and he basically talked today about the second bit. It's a picture that we missed the first one, because there's a sort of a very thorough analysis of Ranciere, which I enjoyed very much reading, especially the differentiation that you make when you analyze this paradoxical and very particular type of relationship in Ranciere, which is precisely politics, and you sort of speak of the politics in two different senses. On the one hand, the politics that reveals the counted and the uncounted, the gap, and on the other hand, the politics of the subject. The subject, which is
essentially divided somehow. And I find it that differentiation in particular, for me, that I'm also interested in Ranciere, very helpful, and I was also learning while reading your work. So thank you very much for that. Basically, Mykolas' argument is that Ranciere's approach is very interesting and useful, because precisely makes the invisible visible, the uncounted counted. But there is an important but here. Ranciere does not provide the theoretical clues, he says, for the resolution of this conflict. So the question basically Mykolas wants to raise is, can democratic politics, and I highlight here democratic politics, alter or transform society, and if it can, on what grounds, right? He argues, as I said, that Ranciere provides an answer, but although a limited one, and he draws on primarily on Castoriadis, because he thinks that the concept of anarchy needs to be re-problematized in a sense. And he finds the idea of expanding the anarchy to not only the counted but also to the uncounted could be useful to rethink of how this conflict could find a solution. That is one of his points, and his second important point is this idea of accentuating the potentiality of democracy as a supplement to the logic of police. And I was wondering here, and maybe this is one point that you want to say something about it, that when I was reading this, it came up to my mind that this idea that Butler also works between, which is slightly different from Laclau, that speaks about universality and particularity, whereas Butler says, well, actually there are competing universalities here. So there is a counterpoint that I think is kind of related to this problem. Finally, I won't go into the detail of the society of self-instituting and all that, which because I'm not an expert on Castoriadis, I've already told you that. But there's something that's still kind of maybe I'd like to hear something more in terms of the to what extent this idea of coming from a non-democratic anarchy towards a democratic anarchy, to what extent this idea is presents some problems with the Ranciere. I mean, you are trying to articulate these ideas, but to what extent this is possible? That would be the question. And does it mean does this idea mean the elimination of the gap, or because somehow the idea behind Ranciere and also Laclau and also Moore is that there's a simplification somehow. The politics is the simplification of the political sphere in one agonistic conflict. If we take that there's one anarchy in a sense that covers the counted and the uncounted, does it mean the elimination, or how you rethink about that? And finally, Ranciere, I think he doesn't speak about democratic politics, because as you said, you well said it in the first part of your paper, for Ranciere, politics equals democracy. So to what extent it's how you are going to re-problematize this idea of democratic policies, which you draw in the end, right? Well, that's my comment to Mykolas, and very less than 1 minute to Victoria, because I think your paper was only available this morning,
Yeah.
right? So
Sorry.
I was not able to read it. But maybe you, it would be interesting to hear about, because you mentioned in your presentation that your aim is to precisely make a counterpoint between the ontology of creation in Castoriadis with the deliberative democracy, and I think you haven't had time to develop the idea of deliberative democracy. Maybe you can sort of briefly point out the core of your argument there.
Okay. Shall we proceed? Yes, let's proceed to the other speaker. Okay, 5-10 minutes.
Okay, I found both of these papers very fascinating, and I learned a lot from both of them, from Marina's paper and Sam's paper. I'll begin with my comments on Sam's paper. I found this essay to be remarkably thought-provoking, with many astute points. It's carefully argued, well supported through textual references, and part of an important theoretical current. Ultimately, however, I'm not persuaded by the claim that Negri expands and strengthens Schmitt's theory of legitimacy. For me, the opposites don't touch in this case, and here are my critical remarks. For one, you claim that Schmitt's conception of sovereignty is, quote, not defined in terms of some groundless, irrational will expressed in arbitrary and personal decisions, unquote. Rather, you argue that Schmitt finds modern sovereignty in, quote, the people. And you infer from this that Schmitt provides a, quote, radical and pure theory of democratic legitimacy in which the constituent popular will stands as, quote, a normative criterion on the basis of which we can evaluate the validity of existing constitutions. But why do you find, I agree with you so far, but why do you assume that the constituent popular will is not in itself groundless, irrational, and arbitrary? What, in your opinion, constitutes the ground of the constituent popular will for Schmitt? What guarantees its rationality? And what makes it non-arbitrary? And more importantly, if Schmitt only affords the power of acclamation and disapproval to the people, then how can the constituent popular will of the people, in what way will it not become personalistic or concentrated in the person of a single individual, the figure of the leader, the president? In fact, doesn't Schmitt himself suggest as much in constitutional theory when he writes, quote, the president has a direct connection with the people. Ideally, he is thought of as a man who unites in himself the trust of the entire people, not as a party man, but as a trustee of the entire people. Okay. Secondly, on page 6, in your discussion of Schmitt's thought, you elucidate the association he draws between the constitution-making power, that's the constituent power, on the one hand, and popular sovereignty on the other. This prompts you to state that Schmitt, quote, designates the people as the legitimate subject of the pouvoir constituant. The people are the legitimate subject of the constitution-making power, and their sovereignty lies largely in their power to grant themselves their constitution, in your words. However, in your discussion of Negri on page 11, you cite two passages, one in the body of the text and another in the footnotes, in which you argue that for Negri, the constituent power clashes with constitutionalism. Does this not mean that the constituent power is not oriented toward constitution making in Negri's thought? You said as much in your but if this is the case, if the constituent power were oriented toward constitution making, would this not mean that the multitude, as the subject of the constituent power, acts to realize its own enslavement? And if this is the case, how is it possible to argue, as you do on page 16, that Negri expands and strengthens Schmitt's theory of democratic legitimacy? It appears to me that not only does Negri not do this, but Schmitt's view contradicts Negri's on this point. For Schmitt, the constituent power acts to create constitutions. For Negri cannot do so unless, of course, it acts somehow to create constitutions that do not partake in the quality of constitutionalism, which is impossible. Thirdly, along the same lines, as a second critique, you cite Negri as stating the constituent power is boundless, and that its only measure is the limitlessness of the multitude. A beautiful statement, in my opinion, but what would Schmitt think about it? I imagine him saying to Negri, quote, this, my friend, or should I say my enemy, is not constituent power. Constituent power is a political concept, and as such, its internal coherence presupposes the existence of the friend-enemy distinction, and its real social historical appearance is exactly what draws a line of demarcation between friends and enemies. And where this occurs, you have boundaries. And where it doesn't occur, you don't have politics, but only the fantasy of a post-political world. From Schmitt's perspective, it seems that the effort to interpret the constituent power as a boundless entity would extricate it from the logic of the friend-enemy binary, and as such, it would set it outside the field of the political. Fourthly, let's talk about the multitude. For Negri, you write, the multitude may be regarded as an infinite multiplicity of free and creative singularities, and that thus understood, constituent power takes shape not as a reduction to one of the singularities, but rather as a place of their expression and cooperation. Parenthetically, I might note, this sounds very much like Habermas's notion of the public sphere. You go on to state that the constituent power of the multitude, viewed ontologically, is nothing other than the creation of the new social being, a new human nature. Each person reinventing himself or herself with others, producing a common life and a new social body. But in this common life, in this new social body, will antagonisms exist? Will there be friends and enemies? If not, then another point of dissonance arises between Schmitt and Negri. And, moreover, what guarantees that the constituent power, as a space in which singularities express themselves and cooperate, will have the creative and emancipatory orientation that Negri seems to ascribe to it, and that will not head in the opposite direction of, say, exclusion, hierarchy, and heteronomy? What prevents this power from acting self-destructively? And what forecloses the possibility that it will generate a self-subjugating consensus? Okay. Finally, there's the question of ontology. I can see why Negri turns to ontology. He does so because his theory of the constituent power is by and large a theory of historical novelty, a theory of how the new comes into being. A new being, you cite him as saying, a new world of life. To support this view further, you write, quote, Negri's notion of constituent power emphasizes creative originality and the intrinsic capacity of human practice to usher the new into the world. But does Negri emphasize, or does he simply assert this capacity? One emphasizes something that is already established in the minds of others. It seems to me that the creative capacity of the multitude and the constituent power still needs to be demonstrated by Negri and others, and I am in support of these efforts undertaken to do so, and perhaps this is why I find your essay so fascinating and theoretically important. Now, with regard to Marina's paper, as I said earlier, I find this paper to be fascinating as well. And I find, in this case, the argument to be powerful and more persuasive. Your argument cuts to the heart of what, through a repackaging of Badiou's phraseology, we might call, quote, the subjective disposition of the democratic revolutionary. That is, a subjective disposition based first on a will to deconstruct the instituted normative order through a sustained interrogation of this order, and secondly, a will to bring into being a new coherence that would account for hitherto unaccounted persons. In my interpretation of your main argument, Dissensus names the effect of the deconstructive will in this subjective disposition. That's how I interpret your main argument. But a few critical points. First, I'm a bit unclear about the meaning that you ascribe to the term interpretation. Could you clarify a little what you mean when you say that Olympe Gouche did not have the power to interpret her acts? Do you mean that she did not have the power to control how others would understand or perceive her acts? Would such a power not amount, in effect, to the power to implement a closure of meaning? And I might go even further. Is this not, perhaps, a totalitarian power? Was Stalin not the high example of a person who could control the meaning of his own acts, so to speak, or who attempted to control the meanings of his own acts? Anyway, it seems to me that the meaning of any action exceeds the conscious control and the intent of its actors. So perhaps we might be setting up a false standard there. Secondly, I had trouble discerning the influence of Ranciere's essay, Ranciere in this essay. The influence of Castoriadis, Gramsci, and James Scott seem apparent to me. No doubt this means that you're in good company. But it also raises the question of what really would Ranciere think about your view of Dissensus. Although I have not read his work carefully, it is my understanding that all institutions for Ranciere bring into being social arrangements that rely on the count, or the exclusion of some and the inclusion of others, and thus that all instituted orders constitute impediments to human emancipation. Thus, if with Castoriadis you are saying that the project of autonomy implies acts of institution as much as it implies acts of interrogation, would not Ranciere reject the project of autonomy on the grounds that it's a state project and that it sustains the law of the count, that it presupposes a state form, and thus that it sustains the main impediment to human freedom? Finally, the discussion about the Chinese immigrants dodging the radar of the immigration officer was one of the most fascinating parts of the essay for me. However, cultural autonomy, in the colloquial sense of the term, does not necessarily coincide with Castoriadis' theory of autonomy. The semi-independent immigrant communities he described would be autonomous, in Castoriadis' opinion, if and only if their members determine the laws that regulate their lives through a conscious, lucid, collective instituting activity that they undertook as equals. Does this exist in these immigrant communities? Whether or not it's happening, it's an empirical question. But I think, nonetheless, it is important to maintain a strict distinction between the colloquial meaning of the term cultural autonomy and Castoriadis' theory of autonomy. But in closing, I think you're bringing forth a very crucial point when you argue that the project of autonomy involves both the labors of interrogation and institution.
Okay, so I do want to proceed. Shall we have first a quick answer, or shall we open the floor? We open the floor. We collect all the questions, and then we have 10 minutes at the end for replies. Yeah. Or shall we have back and forth? I don't know. Do you have a preference here? Okay, let's see. Questions.
Okay, I have a question to Victoria, because at the end of your talk you touched upon a very interesting question about Castoriadis' interpretation of what happened in the Soviet Union, and you start from the kind of Trotsky's interpretation that there is a struggle between, let's say, bureaucracy and the working class, bureaucracy being understood as some another class or quasi-class. So this is like a point of the departure from Castoriadis. I would like to ask you whether you can elaborate more how actually Castoriadis differs in his interpretation of what happened to this kind of standard Trotskyist account, because he's going certainly beyond that, and he's not. He does not believe that it can be kind of understood simply in that kind of class terms or kind of sociological terms. So I just wonder whether you can kind of elaborate on that.
Sure. I mean, I accept that Castoriadis just goes further than viewing conflict in terms of class struggle, viewing the Russian question in terms of class struggle. He does start, together with the fall in 1946, I believe, from that standard Trotskyite hypothesis, that the bureaucracy represents another class, and that. However, where he differs to start with, through the Marxist analysis of that, is that he argues that, yes, the bureaucracy may have formed as another class in the Soviet Union, as he says, and the bureaucracy has its parallel in the West. However, this class did not disappear, right? And it was not going to disappear, but rather it almost ossified itself as I don't know, to use, I suppose, Move's terms as an adversary, or, as an enemy, right, to the people. So you still had the kind of Marxist opposition between those who are dominant and those who are dominated, right? But at the same time, you have a slightly different, a change in the actors. You have the executors. Does that make sense? Does that answer to it? But he doesn't. I mean, he doesn't stay with that. That is what I was trying to underline. Is in his early writings how this idea of conflict developed, and in his early writings, in his militant kind of political involvement with Socialist in Bavaria initially. That was the position. He took the Trotskyite position. He did move away from that position as he moved afterwards away from Marxism. But I would kind of counter what you suggested, that that to start with that was different. Sorry.
The main difference between Castoriadis and Trotskyist ideas in 46, 47 is that Castoriadis doesn't think that USSR is a degenerated worker state. That's Trotsky thinking about USSR, you know. For Castoriadis and for Lefort and for Socialisme Barbarie, USSR is a state capitalist. It is a model of state capitalism. So you have the West, which is more or less pre-capitalism, and the East, USSR and the Warsaw Pact, which is state capitalism. That's one major difference. And then you have bureaucracy, which is not really a class, but which is a principle. Bureaucracy is the separation of the one who give orders and the one who execute orders. You have bureaucracy in the West, you have bureaucracy in the East. And then, about the transformation of Castoriadis thought, in the beginning of the 80s, he wrote a book called Devant la guerre, where he said that USSR is known as a stratocracy, stratocratia, which means that the one who governs in USSR is the army, the Red Army, actually. And that brought the definite separation between Castoriadis and Lefort, because Lefort said, okay, so if you have a stratocracy, there is no party left in USSR, so the Communist Party isn't important anymore, and so on and so forth. Okay. And I had a question for maybe many panelists about the difference between Castoriadis and Ranciere, because I totally agree with what Gerasimos said just a bit earlier, is that Ranciere and Castoriadis have very conflicting views on democracy. It's exactly the opposite sometimes. Because for Ranciere, democracy is politics in his sense, of course, but it's not police. And Ranciere would say, and I heard him say once, that Castoriadis' democracy is just police. Okay, it's a better police than a totalitarian state or even liberal oligarchies and so on and so forth, but it still is a thought about police. Whereas, of course, Ranciere is trying to think about politics, which is not police, but as he said, la part des sans parts, so the part of people who have no part at all. Okay, so I want to review that.
Okay, so let's have a round of answers. I don't know who wants to take up on this question, which was for more family.
Okay, I'll talk about that, and I'll also tie it up a little bit to the questions that Gerasimos posed. Thank you, Gerasimos, for really excellent questions. As I said in my own presentation, I don't try to have necessarily Castoriadis and Ranciere speak to each other, because obviously they can't. But I extrapolate the idea of dissensus and autonomy for a very specific reason. Dissensus and autonomy both talk about interrogating the social, the police, the social, the instituted environment. Ranciere does that from the outside. So there is a rupture of the social space, the police for him. For Castoriadis, it's always within. He says the social historical field needs to open a space and allow for interrogation. So this is why I need Ranciere. I cannot go with Castoriadis all the way, because a person like William de Gouges or people who are not citizens, who are illegal migrants or whoever, they're not part of the space. They need to enter in some way. The socio-historical space will not open itself for them. So that's why I want Ranciere in my work, because I personally don't see how, for people who have no right to have rights, I don't see how the socio-historical space will open for them. The international order will not do it for them. And this is also, I don't know how exactly to tie it up, but to me this also goes into the question of cultural autonomy that Gerasimos, you're correct that probably there's sort of a cultural autonomy, but this is exactly what now bothers the institution. Exactly this cultural autonomy that is created by migrant communities, by Turkish Gastarbeiters who refuse to speak German, or I don't know, Muslims who have their own practices. This is what is bothering the police, the institutional environment, and this is why you have in so many countries the governments talking about multiculturalism failing. It's exactly that cultural autonomy that is becoming political, and it's usually language that that is extracted as the norm of whether people are part of the community or not. So ideally, they're supposedly part of the community, but all of a sudden, because they don't speak the language, because they don't follow the cultural practices, their citizenship is challenged. So their belonging to the institutional environment is challenged. So this is also kind of maybe a little bit of Ranciere and Castoriadis combined, but definitely I'm going beyond that after that.
Maybe can I add something on the question of distinction between interrogation and interpretation, and the example of Olympe de Gouges, La Déclaration des droits des femmes. It seems to me that I'm a little bit skeptical about the possibility of distinguishing between interrogation and interpretation as such, even in Castoriadis, in the sense that interrogation implies the opening of the possibilities of interpretations, and interpretation, the possibility of giving new interpretations implies interrogation. So I don't see how you can oppose the two. And it seems to me that even in the empirical example that you were making, like the example of Olympe de Gouges, the two conflate. I mean, the fact that Olympe de Gouges, she was executed allegedly for having supported the restore of monarchy by the French revolutionaries, it doesn't account for the fact that this is what she was really doing, because she was executed for this, but at the same time, most of the people that were saying she was executed because she had dared to break those boundaries that the morality and the good customs had established for centuries. That is, women should not speak up. So I don't see why you see the two so opposite. I mean, particularly in Olympe de Gouges' case, I would precisely say that she did both. She was interrogating the status quo, the exclusion of women, precisely on the same terms that the revolutionaries were using. And when she writes the Declaration of the Right of Women, she uses the same means of interpretation of the revolutionary. She just extended to the women, and thereby she's doing both. I don't see where you're claiming that she loses the control of the means of interpretation.
Should I respond? Okay. Well, basically, the only reason why I bring up the interpretation in the Gouges is because supposedly in the trials, this is exactly the reason why that is given. It's not, oh, she's a woman, she should not be in the political space.
Of course,
so
but we know very well that
but
this is what is alleged by the authorities.
This is the only woman that was tried and executed for her political views. The only one. At least that's what I've read in the sources.
And the Queen.
And the Queen, yeah, but she's a special case. She was eating cakes. So it still for me remains, I mean, we can of course argue, I completely agree that there were other reasons, and even the reasons that they were giving might not be the correct one. But the fact that that the institution or the police or whatever we call that institutional environment that is challenged has the ultimate power to impose a meaning on the people who want to break in. This is what I want to look into, and to see how that power can remain with the challenger rather than with the institution to always reinterpret. So on a completely cognitive level, how is it first of all, the institution accepting, or the police, or whatever, the instituted environment, accepting that there is a challenge that they have to respond to, and then responding in a way that is constitutive for the challenger, rather than diminishing the possibilities for the challenger to reinstitute something.
Okay, there was another question, Julia?
I just simply want to follow up there.
Okay.
My question is for you. I'm with you all the way, but I'm kind of getting confused about the immigrant situation. Living and being born in a country that's filled with immigrants, when he was speaking from France, I kind of joked with her that I can't really say anything because the Statue of Liberty was like a gift from France, which is rumored as Black Lady in Chains, you know, which is the inspiration for me. So, you know, the French aren't really even here. And then I think it was the 40s, blacks were having a very difficult time in this country. And who came to save us? Cuba. Cuba opened it up for the world to see this dispute that was happening with blacks in Harlem. So, do you find this type of, how do you say, anti-citizens help, or whatever you want to call it, in any relation to immigrants really fueling and helping political situations? And I'll only add a comment to that. When I was a kid, I used to love to do the word search magazines, where you circle when you find the word, then we give you stuff like King of Rock and Roll. Now, you know, I know the King of Rock and Roll is not Elvis Presley, but I wanted to totally solve the entire puzzle, so I put it down, you know. But my question is the prior.
Well, I'm not familiar with the specific case that you're talking about, the Cubans challenging sort of the socio-institutional environment, but so that it allowed for people here to express themselves. Is this?
Oh yes, there was you know the norm, the lynching, the beating of blacks, and Cuba put it forth for the rest of the world, basically to see, and it put pressure on the situation, making it easier for us to you know, politically express ourselves.
Look, again, I'm not familiar with that, but I don't know to what extent putting an external pressure on the institution without actually helping the people themselves would really count as an example, because it seems that from what you're saying, the pressure was put directly on, let's say, the U.S. government, but did not really allow for the blacks here to have the means to challenge the institutions. I don't know.
What about the
It's
Statue of Liberty?
It's possible, but it depends. I don't know the specific story.
Okay.
Julia?
Yeah, thank you. I have a few questions to Marina. This could be short. I really liked your approach. The first one is, when you draw the boundaries between your conception of language, would you include also semiotics, or is it just like written language? Because I'm thinking about forms of using, for example, colors in revolutionary movements to signify the visibility of each one of those. I mean, that's one way of coming together. So that's like, how do you define language? It's a very broad question. You can say something about that. The other one is that what would you imply to people like coming from a post-structuralist background, like Sarah Ahmed, for example, who would say that you are never in charge of the making of significations or re-significations, because we are all products of this social linguistic discourse. It's like taking Foucault to the extreme, kind of. So I would be interested in hearing what would you say, because I like your approach. I think it's important.
Okay. So let me start with the second question first. Yes, I have been working through Ahmed to to see to what extent we are actually products of certain significations and resignifications. And I would say that in general, migrants are probably the first instance where they break through the world of significations and resignifications is when they leave their home environment and sort of challenge their ways through their first understanding of living and where they live and what they do. So usually, and especially for illegal migrants, crossing borders, challenging institutions, trying to find other socioeconomic means of subsistence means that already they at least for me, it means that they already have problems with the way significations have been constituted. And that's the first instance of them challenging and working through these. And this is also why I like Ranciere, because you have to break through your constituted environment in order to start breaking others, I think. Yes, probably you're right on the visibility, and I need to look more into that. But it's very possible that it's there. Red alerts.
Okay, we have only 5 minutes left, so I would collect the questions. Who wants Wander and John, and that's it. Okay, and then we'll have a brief answer for round of the table.
Yeah, I like the idea of comparing Schmitt to whoever, the opposite, where there's no comparison. I spent a lifetime doing that. Heraclitus, you've been throwing the name around. I'm glad you are. He said, in the end, everything turns into its opposite. So you've got him as the original reference. You also have Jung with his superconsciousness. Eventually, we all understand each other in that element. But more so, it's the word if. Well, there's Schmitt and there's Mykolas. And if, well, that's the intellectual game. Let's play. We can say anything here, there, everywhere, and eventually you'll get the comparison. In other words, there's a whole range of ways that you can get opposites to interact. The clearest example was a question I had: compare Hamlet and Tybalt. I said, oh, they're alike. They're the same. They're jumping into graves together. They're listening to one to Polonius, the other to his father. And the response was, but the approach is that they are different. One is impulsive and the other one is reticent. He can't act. Well, that might be the initial thing that perhaps your respondents saw about Schmitt and Mykolas. But if you delve deeper, right, I get the feeling that you can always make a cogent, coherent argument about those polarities.
Thank you. John?
This is going to be a general question, so I'll be happy with some of this stuff and answer. And it's going to be like, I found so many commonalities, but the only fundamental thing that I see is there is no reference to any contemporary movements in your papers. And I find it like there are some instances, but not really through examination. And I know there are limits, I can see that, but it directly relates me, directs me to difference between radical democracy and radical democratic theory. And I was always supposing that the difference emerged out of like criticism of meta-narratives or grand theories speaking on behalf of people, like Marxism. And this is what Castoriadis and Ranciere speaks of, and elaborates a new theory that gives like some speech to people, that takes a egalitarian approach from theory to the practice. But if you are really like honest with ourselves right now, and if you can see that this indicates a problem, that there is no recent contemporary radical democratic, whatever you call a movement, so the reason why you're interested in these theories, can be like, I see the way that you're interested in theories because either you want to work on social imaginary or imagination. Like, if I write this paper, would be better for people to read it and have a different imaginary? Or is it like the examination of like our contemporary problem? If it, you say as a problem, I mean, is it going to be like speaking on behalf of people again?
Okay, thank you for this question. I would have a round of answers going the opposite direction. And if you can throw a sort of a follow-up question to the series of questions he's been raising for you. It seems to me, I mean, I know this is a paper on Carl Schmitt, but it seems to me that if, given all the problems in putting Schmitt together with Negri, to which I would add two very different basic ontology. In the case of Negri, it's Spinoza's ontology, so very materialistic, peculiar ontology, which it seems to me not so easy to reconcile with Schmitt. But let's say, even assuming that this is possible, if what you want to do is to argue that in order to have political democracy, you need economic democracy, would you not be much better off just with Negri, rather than beginning with Carl Schmitt? Just a question. And then, yeah, I would go. Please, 3 minutes each.
Yeah, I'll keep it brief. Thank you for the comments. One question, the first question that was raised was the how do we answer the potential groundlessness of the constituent power itself, its own possibilities for irrationality. I would just briefly mention, in fact, Karavitis has done some interesting work in this respect, and that the very idea of the constituent power contains within it certain norms. That the prefix "con" together with implies commitment to certain basic principles: accountability, equality of vote, transparency, those perhaps. So I think there may be a way to address that word. And I would also mention, as far as the president, Schmitt's conception of the president, I think that's totally valid concern. I would suggest that that if really we're going to seriously try and see where these two thinkers can touch we would have to, in all likelihood, jettison Schmitt's notion of strong presidentialism. These are two vastly different thinkers, and I would just, I would. There's no way we would bring them together entirely, accepting them all both on their own terms. We have to, rebuild, reconstruct. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you also for keeping it short, Victoria.
So I don't know in which order to answer the questions. Regarding the relation between revolutionary theory and revolutionary practice, I mean, you're absolutely right. Karavitis does say that they have to develop in interdependence of one another. You can't have one in isolation. And certainly there was a question for the earlier panel about some potential hegemony, or I don't know, hierarchy there being between philosophy being at the top and then practice at the bottom, and philosophy informing practice. And for Karavitis certainly, as he replied to some of his critics, it was not the ancient Greece that informed his early political writings and his early interest in politics. It was the Greece of 1941, and the attacks on dictatorship, Nazi invasions, and so on and so forth. In terms of contemporary movements, it is very true. I mean, I am a political theorist, which means that, and despite the fact that every time when I write, I keep particular movements in mind, I do tend to focus on the theoretical side of the issues. However, I mean, personally, I was born in the USSR, right? Beyond the Iron Curtain, in a country that is now Moldova, and certainly kind of a year and a half ago we had the first Twitter revolution in that, right? So this kind of theorization of revolutionary moments or revolutionary explosions and how this somehow has a potential to reinvigorate democracy, right? But it also lies at the very heart of democracy. You do not have any other, I don't know, system of governance or any other project, political project, that actually embodies self-question in its very heart. I think that's why democracy, and for Karavitis, certainly radical democracy, although perhaps different from Lafayette movement from the deliberative side. I mean, that is why it is important, because we have this ethos of self-question. And in my own home country, certainly we still have a long way to go, and that is why I completely agree with Karavitis that autonomy, democracy, those are not end goals, they're not starting points. This is a project, this is a process that you just have to keep at it. It's something that you act and enact and react. Regarding the deliberative, the question that I had at the start about deliberative democracy, I don't know if I may be permitted to kind of give an anecdote rather than answer that directly.
As far as it is short.
It is a short one. So, in a visit to the Lagado Academy, Jonathan Swift's Gulliver encounters a doctor that had found the perfect solution to political conflict. And that is that when you have two parties which are fighting with one another, you cut their skulls in half and then their respective brains and connect them and give them basically the advantage of having a common skull. And then within this common skull, they would debate and deliberate until that rationality and reasonable kind of consensus would be achieved. And I think that in a way, this kind of literary example simply overextends, I think, the amount of shared meaning that Habermasian kind of rationally motivated consensus requires, right? And I think what I was trying to do with underlying Karavitis' ontology of creation is precisely speaking somehow covertly in reply to this demand for a rationally motivated consent. And I'm not rejecting reason. I don't think Karavitis rejects reason as such. All I was trying to say is that we can think of reason in a different way and expand the boundaries of reason so that the political solutions that we seek are not necessarily just discursive ones. And I certainly don't think the feminist movement, I don't think that civil rights movements achieved their political aims simply through discursive struggles, the real struggles.
Okay, thank you. So we have now Mykolas.
Yeah, I don't know, I'll try to cover all these questions really quick. Well, I'll stop, like, John, your question. I think it's, in my paper I say simply, democracy is a state of mind. It's nothing institutional, there's nothing like theory, it's a state of mind. It's the way you see the world around you, the way you think. And when I talk about the political relationship, when the subject is being removed from relationship, so the gap that is left, the gap is also double. It's a double within the gap within relationship itself, and then it becomes the gap within the system of police. So in order to, first of all, I have to close the gap in my mind, thinking that I am the part of this relationship. I am the one who's ruling myself. Once I have that psychological disposition, I can proceed with a practical movement to close the gap within the hierarchy, within the system. And that's where I don't think that Ranciere is that simple to kind of say this is police and this is not police. He says the part that has no part, that you said. So there's division. There is a part that has no part. So if we take that part and we ask, what is the part that you do not have? So it's already implemented within his larger framework, within his theory. Because why is he doing that? He's totally aware that there is, if he was totally aware there is no way out, he won't be doing it. But he does, he is doing that. What I think the whole project that he is doing is exactly to point out towards that direction, saying, look, you can think of yourself as a subject of political relationship. You are subject of political relationship.